Welcome everybody. I'd like to welcome members and guests of the Center Club. I want to thank the Center Club and Nancy Sloan is on the call for providing this forum for us here on Veterans Day. And I want to welcome Linda Hervieux, our special guest, author of the book Forgotten. We're getting close to the 11th hour, but it is already the 11th day of the 11th month, which in 1918 marked the end of the fighting in the First World War. It was declared Armistice Day, and now we know it as Veterans Day. So thank you to all the veterans on the call, any family members of veterans on the call. Thank you for your service. Thank you for your sacrifice. And I can't think of a more fitting topic for the times we're living in today. I discovered Linda's book after I'd read a book by John McManus, The Dead and Those About to Die, about Omaha Beach and the 1st Infantry Division, the George Floyd incident, and then Memorial Day shortly after that, and D-Day shortly after that. I started to wonder, were there any Black soldiers at D-Day? Because I hadn't heard any stories about them, and I came upon, in a Google search, Waverly Woodson, which led me to Linda's site. And so I'm going to hand it over to Linda. Linda is I'm going to read this right from her website. So Linda is a journalist, photographer, whose work has appeared in publications including the New York Times, the International Herald Tribune, New York Daily News, and the Daily Beast. She's a native of Lowell, Massachusetts, and she lived for many years in Brooklyn before moving to Paris, France with her husband. And she is the author of this book. And I want to thank her again. We've been talking for the last couple of months to get this arranged, and very grateful that she's able to spend some time with us today. We've got 90 minutes scheduled. Linda's presentation will last about 45 minutes. And then if you want to ask a question, please put it through the chat, and we'll make sure that question gets answered. So without further ado, Linda, the floor is yours.
Well, many thanks to the Center Club of Baltimore and to Lou and to Nancy for inviting me today, and for all of you for tuning in. Good morning, very, very early. I'm in Paris, so I'm 6 hours ahead of you. So thank you for coming on this day, Veterans Day 2020. I'd also like to acknowledge the veterans who are with us today. Thank you so much for your service to our country. Also, some family members of the veterans of my book, Forgotten, are Zooming in today. Thank you to the Center Club for allowing them to join us. And please, really, any questions that you have, I'm happy, and they're happy too, I'm sure, to type in an answer into the chat if you have something also for them. Now I would like to, I'm going to share my screen with you, and I would also like to acknowledge a Baltimore member of, sorry, here we are. This is Albert Griet Wood. This is taken right from his bio that's on my website. And also,
Linda, I don't think we're seeing your screen.
One thing, can you see that?
I don't think we're seeing your screen.
No, okay. And one thing too, also, those of us joining us, please mute your microphones. Otherwise, everyone will be seeing you they're at home. Okay, let me see if I can try this again and have it work. Share. All right, how about now?
We got it, thank you.
Is that working? Okay, perfect. So let's see, so this is, bear with the technology as we go into our slideshow. Yeah, so this is Mr. Wood. Now, Mr. Wood was terrified of being shipped out to the South from Baltimore. He had heard all of these stories about Black men arrested on false charges, forced to work on chain gangs. And while he never encountered that thankfully never happened to him, he was very, very frank with me about the discrimination and the bitterness that he faced in the United States Army. And you can read his words here. I will talk a little bit more about that as we get into this presentation. I know that you were given access to my trailer for my book. I would just like to hold on one second. I'd like to just play that trailer for you because here we are. Because it really sums up in the book, and it's very short. It says a couple minutes, and you can also hear the voices of some of the men in there. You can even hear Mr. Wood's voice. So here we are with the trailer.
My name is Henry Palm, and I belong to the 220th Anti-Aircraft Balloon Barrage Battalion.
My name is William Garfield Abney. I was with the 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion.
My name is Arthur Guest, 3451 9688.
One reason I ain't had no reason to go fighting because the American wasn't that good a place to fight for, not for a black man.
I did feel like it was our duty to try to protect our country, even though we weren't recognized as 100% citizens.
When we got into England, people invited us and they wanted to treat us nice because we was Americans. And that's what they kept calling us, American.
We was all trained to handle these balloons. You would send the balloons up on the cable and that let it up and bring it in. It was something like a canister bomb, and it would pull the bomb right down into the wing of the plane, and boom, the plane would blow up.
I saw many things strange. It's not good to talk about, but I never shall forget.
Okay. So you heard in the middle there a little bit from Mr. Wood, also Waverly Woodson from Clarksburg, Maryland. He's originally from West Philadelphia, you'll hear, but from Clarksburg, and some of his family from Maryland is here with us today. So one of the things that I would like to talk about today is who are our heroes? Who are our historians? Who determine the pictures that we have in our memories of our shared history as Americans? Who are the historians recording our present history? Will future generations need to correct the record as we have had to do? These were some of the questions that were on my mind as I researched my book, and I'd like for you to think about them today And I think it's particularly relevant today on Veterans Day in this very tumultuous year that we talk about that a little bit. The reason you're looking at a slide here of Paul Revere, some of us from grade school might have remembered this. Certainly those of us from Massachusetts know all about this. We Americans are told to remember our history. It is something we hear all the time. Remember, school children learn about the midnight ride of Paul Revere, but not always the actions of Crispus Attucks, the runaway slave who was the first to die in the Boston Massacre. We're told to remember the Civil War, whose battles are still reenacted today. There are tens of thousands of plaques across the South remembering that war and the heroes of the Confederate States of America. Yet until very recently, there were no markers to slavery, to the generations of enslaved men, women, and children of color who reached our shores more than 400 years ago. We're implored to remember the Alamo, but not the war of attrition waged on African Americans after the Civil War, not Jim Crow, that system of legal segregation codifying white supremacy and perpetuating unspeakable racism into our lifetimes. We have monuments to remember the men who died for freedom in the First World War more than a century ago. But until April 2018, when the National Memorial for Peace and Justice opened in Montgomery, Alabama, there were no monuments to the nearly 4,000 African Americans lynched between 1877 and 1950. In 1919 alone, 77 Black men were killed by lynch mobs. Many of these murders were public events with children among the gleeful crowd, collecting fingers, toes, and ears as souvenirs. Some of those men killed in 1919 were veterans in uniform. 2 of them were burned alive. And the greatest generation of the Second World War are still very much on our minds. There are museums and memorials dedicated to these men and women. They fill the pages of many, many books, and they still fascinate on our movie screens, but not all of them. Some men, even those who were stars in their day, were forgotten. I'd like to tell you a little bit about them, and I'll begin with the African Americans of D-Day. In June 2009, for the 65th anniversary of D-Day, the French government honored an American veteran named William Garfield Dabney. They gave him the Legion of Honor, which is France's highest decoration, for his service on June 6, 1944. He is wearing it here, the Legion of Honor, for me in this picture taken in his backyard in Roanoke, Virginia. Bill was a member of the 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion, the only African-American combat unit at D-Day. These men were charged with a strange mission: to raise a silver curtain of balloons over 2 of the 5 invasion beaches in Normandy, the American beaches, Omaha and Utah. The balloons formed a defensive curtain over the coast to protect the men and materiel from dive-bombing German planes. This is the only known photograph of the 320th on Omaha Beach. The balloons worked like so. If an enemy plane snagged the cable, it would become trapped as if in a spider's web until it stalled and crashed. The balloons that went to war, though, packed a secret punch. With a cable strike, a small bomb would descend and a good hit could take out a wing or explode the gas tank. And this is a barrage balloon battalion demonstrating how the balloons work in Washington, D.C. We reporters wrote about Bill Dabney in 2009, and we noted that his battalion was all Black. Well, what did that mean in the segregated U.S. Army? Well, it meant that the enlisted men and women and some of the non-commissioned officers were Black. Perhaps a few of the officers up to first lieutenant in this unit were Black, but the top officers were always white. This is Colonel Leon J. Reed. He was the commander of the 320th. Unlike many white commanding officers who mistreated men of color, did not want to lead them in the first place, but Colonel Reed was proud to lead this specialized unit, and he was well respected by his men. Bill Dabney received his medal at a ceremony at Invalides in Paris, the French temple to all things military, where Napoleon is buried under the gold dome. After the ceremony, Bill shook the hands of Steven Spielberg and Tom Hanks. Bill had no idea who they were until his son, Vinny, told him. But he knew very well that there were no men of color storming Omaha Beach in their movie, Saving Private Ryan. We do, however, see the balloons. In fact, no movies about D-Day show Black soldiers. All Black veterans know this. Few books about D-Day mention the 320th or that there were nearly 2,000 African-American troops on the Normandy beaches by the end of that extraordinary day. The 320th was among 2 Black units given a commendation by General Eisenhower for their service, yet we don't know about them. And why does that matter? Well, there were many who consider D-Day to be the most important day of the 20th century. For the Allied commanders knew that if they could get their troops onto those beaches and up and over those bluffs, it was only a matter of time until their troops would be marching through Berlin. And I would argue that to exclude a significant portion of our population from that epic battle does America a tremendous disservice. The great General Omar Bradley said that all men who landed on Omaha Beach were heroes, yet there were heroes among the heroes. As I began research into my book, I learned that one of the men of the 320th, a college student, would become a star in Black America and beyond for his service on Omaha Beach. He would be nominated for the Medal of Honor. He would not get it. None of the 1 million African Americans who served in World War II received America's highest honor until 1997, when Bill Clinton awarded 7 of them. Those awards came after an independent study commissioned by the Army found that pervasive racism within the ranks denied deserving Black soldiers the decorations they deserved and the opportunities they deserved. I'd like to tell you about that 320th soldier. His name was Waverly Bernard Woodson Jr. And I'll start with what Woodson saw on the morning of D-Day. His description of peace and calm struck me when I heard his interviews, many of them during the 50th anniversary of D-Day. I'd never heard D-Day described that way, June 6, 1944. So I'll read you just a portion of this. This is the start of chapter 8 of my book, The Greatest Hour. Waverly Woodson squinted into the distance. From the deck of the boat, he could see little. A thick cloud blanket hung overhead, and the heavy air pressed in from all sides. Drenched fatigues clung to Woodson's weary limbs. For hours now, he had peered into the blackness. A stripe of pink brightened the eastern horizon, first light. In the dark, choppy waters of the English Channel, Woodson found serenity, even beauty. It would be one of his last tranquil moments on this very long day. It was a strange place to find peace. Above, the sky hummed with Allied planes, and all around, thousands of vessels of every size steamed toward France. On Woodson's ship, men were gray with seasickness. Their single Army-issue vomit bag was long used up, so they heaved into their steel helmets, then tipped them over the side to be rinsed in the cresting swells. When that effort proved too much, they heaved wherever they could. Puddles of sick pooled at their ankles. The metal boat pitched forward and back with each roll. Dying would be better than this. Some of them said that. The storied channel had thwarted generations of marauders to keep Britannia safe, at least most of the time. The Roman Emperor Caligula's soldiers mutinied rather than sail these waters thick with mermaids. On this day, the invaders were heading in the opposite direction, their mission to conquer a continent systematically crushed by an enemy for whom freedom meant very little. To Woodson, freedom meant a great deal. He had lived it fully for the first time in a friendly village in Oxfordshire, where he'd met white people pleased to be his friend and a postmistress happy to dance with him. That might not have seemed like much to other men, but Woodson would never forget it. So this is Waverly Woodson's backstory. He was not a likely candidate to be on Omaha Beach. Odds were low that a Black soldier would be among the 34,000 American troops on this beach. But Woodson was used to defying expectations. The young man from West Philly hadn't waited for a draft notice. He left his pre-med studies at Lincoln University and enlisted in the Army on December 15, 1942. His younger brother Eugene signed up too and was stationed in Texas with a unit of the Tuskegee Airmen. Their parents were beyond proud, and the doings of the Woodson brothers were tracked in the Black newspapers back home. There are many, many Woodson family photo albums. Here's a few. So there were two armies in America in World War II, Black and white. There were two of everything: barracks, mess halls, service clubs, buses, train cars. It was a highly inefficient and extremely expensive way to run an army. Yet there was one sector that was integrated: officer candidate school. The Army didn't think that Black men were smart enough to score high enough on the entrance exam, an exam heavily weighted to favor whites in their education, and so they didn't bother to set up a separate system. But Woodson scored high on the test and trained as an anti-aircraft artillery officer. In the end, there were no officer positions available to him. This was a common story for Black officers whose service was limited by quotas and the rule that they not lead white officers junior to them. So Woodson was assigned to train as a medic with the 320th. On the morning of June 6th, he was headed for Omaha Beach with 4 other medics. The order to ship out had been a huge relief. Some of us don't remember. There had been of course, even from reading about it, there had been a heat wave in June of 1944. Woodson and the medics had endured several uncomfortable days aboard their jam-packed landing craft tank with 6 other men waiting for the order to go. The rest of the 320th was scattered among more than 150 landing craft. Thousands of barrage balloons had been inflated in England and tethered to ships to provide protection from enemy dive bombers. You can see the balloons here on June 7th, 1944, the day after. Most of the 621 men in the 320th's landing force were headed to Omaha Beach, which was 5 miles long and had been called Beach 313 until the Americans got more creative. A battery of the 320th was headed to the American beach, the other one, Utah. As the boat carrying Woodson and the medics approached Omaha Beach, all eyes were on the water. I'll read you the rest of Woodson's landing from my book. As the boat carrying Woodson and the medics approached Omaha, all eyes were on the water. Around them, men bobbed in a sea made red by their own blood. Those still alive waited to be pulled from the drink by boats that might never come. The skippers of the landing craft had been ordered to ignore their cries for help, and men in motor launches with megaphones dissuaded those with second thoughts. "You are not a rescue ship," hollered one of them. "Get on shore." First, Woodson's craft hit a mine, which blew out the motor. Then another blast exploded on the right side, felling troops like matchsticks. The heavy fire kept coming. The LCT's 40mm guns, which had been blazing moments earlier, now lay silent. The bodies of their gunners hung lifeless, as if from a gruesome clothesline. A shell landed on the hood of a Jeep, incinerating the 4 men inside. Woodson crouched beside a truck filled with medical supplies. A soldier besides Woodson was struck and killed as metal shards rained on deck and another shell exploded in the water. Woodson reached down and brought up a hand covered in blood. "I am dying," he thought. One of the medics slapped dressings on his buttocks and inner thigh ripped open by shrapnel. "Close," Woodson would say later, "mighty close." The medics tended to the few men still living. The helpless craft drifted to a stop. The ramp fell with a bang. And to Woodson's surprise, the tank came alive. It rolled down the ramp onto the beach and turned right. The men followed it, splashing down in 4 feet of water. Woodson hit the beach and ran, slugs popping many geysers of sand at his feet. Woodson looked back and saw the tank's turret in flames. No men were coming out. It was 9 a.m. In the shelter of the shingle, Woodson unpacked a tent roll he had pulled out of the water. Now there was a medical station. The rising tide carried in the dead and threatened to drown the living. Under constant fire, the medics dragged the wounded and the dead out of the shooting gallery at the water's edge. Their Red Cross brassards made them easy targets for German snipers hiding in the bluffs, who ignored the rules of war and fired on many medics that day. There were too many men who needed saving. Their cries for help would haunt Woodson. On Omaha, war was a great equalizer. At that time, Woodson would say later, they didn't care what color my skin was. Throughout the day and night and into the next day, Woodson worked through his pain to save lives. He pulled out bullets, patched gaping wounds, and dispensed blood plasma. He amputated a right foot. When he thought he could do no more, he resuscitated 4 drowning men. 30 hours after he set his boots on Omaha Beach, Woody Woodson collapsed. There is a sole piece of paper at the Truman Library in Independence, Missouri, that proves that Waverly Woodson was nominated for the Medal of Honor. It is a handwritten note from an aide in the War Department to an aide in the White House that says, "Here is a Negro from Philadelphia who has been recommended for a suitable award." Emphasis is in the original. And that US General John Lee in Britain upgraded that recommendation to the Medal of Honor. The note continues, "This is a big enough award that the president can give it personally, as he has in the case of some white boys." There is no trace today of the records that explain Waverly Woodson's medals. It is a common story. Only 1% of Army records from World War II exist today. And a fire in the Army's archives in St. Louis, Missouri in 1973 destroyed 80% of personnel records. What we know is this: Woodson got a Purple Heart for his injuries and belatedly a Bronze Star for his service on Omaha Beach. To the Army, the note in the Truman Library is hearsay, but there is further proof of Woodson's actions in Normandy. In the summer of 1944, Waverly Woodson was a huge star. The crusading black press hailed him as #1 invasion hero. White newspapermen came to interview him too. Stars and Stripes wrote that Woodson and the medics covered themselves with glory on D-Day. Woodson returned home a celebrity, and the accolades continued. He was invited to recount his heroics on a nationwide radio show, and the black press began calling on the White House to award him the Medal of Honor. Significantly, stapled to the note in the Truman Library is a press release issued by the Army on August 28, 1944, detailing Woodson's heroism. That the Army would praise the individual actions of a black man on Omaha Beach was nothing short of extraordinary. There was a white soldier who did receive the Medal of Honor for his actions on June 6, actions remarkably similar to Waverly Woodson's, except he wasn't injured. For the 50th anniversary of D-Day, the French government chose a trio of Americans to honor. They flew them to France and presented them with a palm-sized medal commemorating their service in Normandy. They included Waverly Woodson and his wife, Joanne, pictured here around that time. "I was the only black man of the 3, Woodson said proudly. He was 72 years old. Woodson died on August 12, 2005. His grave is in Arlington National Cemetery, where America buries its heroes. Every Memorial Day, Joanne Woodson visits his white marble grave with an armful of the red roses her husband, an avid gardener who won many prizes for roses, loved so much. In June 2015, President Obama awarded the Medal of Honor to a Black soldier from World War I named Henry Johnson. Sergeant Johnson was a member of the legendary Harlem Hellfighters, the 369th Infantry from New York. He single-handedly fought off a German raiding party that attacked the trench he was guarding, using up all his weapons until all he had left was his bolo knife. In this photo, he's wearing his French Croix de Guerre medal. Like Woodson, Johnson was a star. He made headlines from coast to coast. What most of those readers perhaps did not know was that Henry Johnson and his regiment were given over to French command by the American general John J. Pershing, who, contrary to the popular version of his story, had little use for Black men in his army. The Hellfighters fought in French uniforms alongside French poilus and received French medals for their extraordinary record. They served more days on the front lines than any other American unit. The French called them the men of bronze. The Germans called them Hellfighters for their ferocity in battle. Johnson died 11 years after the war in poverty without even a Purple Heart for his injuries and therefore no medical benefits to treat his wartime injuries. In a ceremony at the White House, President Obama said, "It is never too late to say thank you." Let's step back to 1941. In 1941, when the men of the 320th began receiving their draft notices, the Army was a bastion of racism. Its ranks were dominated by Southern commanders who determined that Southern officers like them were best suited to handle Black men. So how bad was it for Black soldiers? Well, to understand the world these men were thrust into, it's necessary to understand that Army policy at that time was a lesson in what happens when racism meets pseudoscience. The science at the time held that Black brains were smaller than white brains, and sometimes hat size was used to measure this difference. An Army War College study from 1925, still on the books, was indicative of the type of thinking that underpinned Army policy toward the Black soldier in World War II. I'll read a part of one such document because it was positively outrageous, even in the 40s. The Negro is profoundly superstitious. He is by nature subservient and naturally believes himself inferior to the white. He is jolly, tractable, lively, and docile by nature, but through real or supposed harsh or unjust treatment may become sullen and stubborn. He has not the physical courage of the white. He simply cannot control himself in fear of some danger in the degree that the white man can. His psychology is such that he willingly accepts hard labor and for this reason can well be employed in labor troops or other non-combatant branches. The Negro is immoral. He simply does not see certain things as wrong. The Negro is one of the most secretive in the world. While the Negro undoubtedly has a state of mind bordering on resentment against the white, this feeling is numbed by his easygoing nature. The Negro's growing sense of importance will make them more and more of a problem, and racial problems may well be expected to increase. That last line was certainly true. Anger in Black America toward the treatment of their men in uniform was rising and would be blamed in part for sparking more than 200 race riots that would rock America in 1943. One of the men who got one of those draft notices in June 1941 was a 21-year-old in Atlantic City named Wilson Caldwell Monk. For Monk, being drafted meant a steady paycheck. The $30 he would earn monthly in the Army was a measure of security he very much needed. In Atlantic City, the country's first planned resort town, there were 3 months to earn your money by stringing together as many jobs as you could before Labor Day, when the curtain in Atlantic City fell and shut up tight. The odds of getting a decent job during the long, cold winter was slight. At the time, America was not at war, so Wilson Monk expected a 1-year commitment. He was in for a big surprise, and an even bigger one when he boarded a train and headed south to his first Army training camp. Somewhere north of Washington, D.C., Monk was told he had to switch to the Negro car. He had no idea what that meant. The Negro car was always hard by the noisy, dirty coal engine, so a soldier in uniform would arrive wherever he was going covered in black soot. The train south was the first taste of Jim Crow for the North's Black recruits who would arrive at their first day of boot camp already fuming. Jim Crow, as you know, was a series of laws in the southern US that ensured the separation of the races. What you may not know is that they included such crimes as pretending to be a white man. After the Civil War, Jim Crow laws spread throughout the South like a poisonous weed, so that by 1890, the races were effectively separate, and Black men and women had to step off sidewalks and avert their eyes when passing whites. At an army base in Pennsylvania, Black troops were warned that any contact with a white woman, whether voluntary or not, would be considered rape, and the penalty, death. Wilson Monk was stationed at Camp Tyson, an army base in northwestern Tennessee, built for the purpose of teaching men to fly barrage balloons. Of the 30 or so units that trained at Tyson, 4 battalions were Black. I called chapter 5 of my book, "We Were Like Little Dogs," because that is how Sergeant Samuel L. Madison from Columbus, Ohio, described the treatment of Black soldiers there to me. This is Sam in 2010, a few months before he died. One day in the spring of 1943, Wilson Monk and some friends boarded a train and headed to Memphis on a weekend pass. They were excited to blow off steam to check out Beale Street and the astonishing things that are happening with Black music. Their first stop was a diner where Monk asked for change to play the jukebox. The man behind the counter threw back a handful of nickels and told Monk, "If you weren't in uniform, you wouldn't get nothing from me." What Monk didn't know was that wearing the uniform of the United States Army usually posed problems for Black soldiers among Southern whites who saw a proud display of patriotism by a Black man as a provocation. And it only got worse. Later, Monk and his friends went looking for a place to grab a bite. Outside one restaurant, they watched, incredulous, as a long line of German prisoners of war filed inside. Black men were not welcome there. Most of us don't know that there were 425,000 German and Italian prisoners of war interned in the United States during World War II, most of them at army bases in the South, where these POWs enjoyed privileges not accorded to Black soldiers. The fact that these enemy prisoners enjoyed often backslapping treatment by their white guards was extremely painful for soldiers like Wilson Monk, who, even 7 decades after the war, spoke about it to me with fresh hurt. But it was in hearing this story from Wilson Monk that I got a lesson about the northern version of Jim Crow. Wilson Monk told me that the restaurant in Memphis was called Child's, and he knew that chain because there was one in Atlantic City. I said, "Oh, but you could eat in that one." And he said, "Oh, no, we couldn't." And that was when I realized how bad life was in the North for African Americans. It was a lesson I hadn't learned in any of the schools I had attended, and not in any sort of detail anyway. And I had an average Northern Massachusetts education. And I wondered why we Americans must take specialized classes to learn about our own history. And it's one of the reasons why I wrote this book. So remember my question, who are our historians? If not for the French government today, we might not know about the 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion. We might not know that there were nearly 2,000 African-American troops on the Normandy beaches on D-Day, but these soldiers of color were not alone. This is Doris Miller, known as Dory. He was the first hero of World War II, the first. The Navy initially did not want to recognize him and suppress the story of his heroism at Pearl Harbor. As the Japanese sneak attack got underway, Miller, a cook aboard the USS West Virginia, jumped behind an anti-aircraft artillery gun and began firing. He took out a few German planes with guns he had never been trained to use. 15 men were awarded the Medal of Honor for their service on December 7th, 1941, including the mortally wounded commander of the ship, whom Miller had dragged to safety, but not Miller. He got the Navy Cross, which at that time was 3rd place. The Navy did feature Miller in a 1943 recruiting poster, but he was never promoted. He was still working as a cook aboard the carrier Lycombe Bay in November 1943 when the ship was struck by a Japanese torpedo and sunk. Of the 900 men aboard, 272 survived, but not Dory Miller. The 761st Tank Battalion, the Black Panthers, fought in 5 countries and captured 30 towns. The 183 days they served in combat was more than any other unit. Their commander, General George S. Patton Jr., made it clear what was expected of them. Everyone has their eyes on you, Patton told them. Most of all, your race. Don't let them down. The Panthers won many decorations, including 11 Silver Stars, but they would have to wait until 1978 for their distinguished unit citation given to them by President Jimmy Carter. America's first Black pilots of the 332nd Fighter Group and the 99th Fighter Squadron, known collectively as the Tuskegee Airmen, spent the war treated like pariahs, as Airman Lee Archer put it. Denied proper training and ignored by their commanders, they went on to fly more than 15,000 individual sorties. The bomber pilots escorted by the red-tailed planes had no idea the men who led them to safety were Black. Today, the Tuskegee Airmen are well known, but it wasn't until a TV movie aired in 1995 that brought their story back into our popular consciousness. The 92nd Infantry Division, with heroic roots dating back to the 19th century Buffalo Soldiers, were vilified during World War II. They were called incompetent and cowardly, yet their record reveals otherwise. In July 1944, one of their regiments, the 366th Infantry, was sent to mount a high-stakes frontal assault on seasoned German troops in Italy. They had only a few days' training and inferior weapons. Their commander, General Edward Ullman, who you see here, greeted their arrival with these words: "I did not send for you. Your Negro newspapers, Negro politicians, and white friends have insisted on you seeing combat, and I shall see that you get combat and your share of casualties." And so, despite suffering 3,000 casualties, and despite a system that shortchanged Black soldiers, the men of the 92nd collected scores of decorations, including 208 Silver Stars and 1,000 Bronze Stars. The 333rd Field Artillery Division, you see them here today. They would land in Normandy in July 1944. They suffered extensive casualties in the Battle of the Bulge. In December, we'll mark the 76th anniversary of another decisive World War II moment, the Battle of the Bulge. So after Germany's surprise attack in the Ardennes forest in Belgium left 80,000 Americans killed, wounded, or captured, more than 2,000 Black service troops answered an urgent call for volunteer riflemen. Many of them were in the labor and service units that Black soldiers were assigned to in disproportionate numbers, and they took demotions for the chance to fight. They impressed their white commanders with their ferocity and drive. Although assigned to segregated platoons, they were the first men of color to fight shoulder to shoulder with white men since the Revolutionary War. "I have never seen any soldiers who performed better in combat than you have," one general told them. Yet many men wouldn't see the medals they were due until years after the war. 2 New York vets waited until the year 2000 for their Bronze Stars. There are many, many stories like this. African Americans served with distinction wherever they were assigned. And not just Black men, more than 4,000 women of color served their country with distinction. African American women served in the Red Cross and the Women's Army Corps during World War II. They worked as nurses and clerks, and some 800 of them were sent overseas to deliver tons of backed up mail to 7 million American soldiers. They were the 688s, the 688th Central Postal Directory Battalion, and that's a mouthful, the first battalion of African American women and the only female battalion to serve in Europe. And lest you think sorting tons of backlogged mail was an easy job, the women of the 688 would have set you straight. They worked in shifts round the clock, 7 days a week, while billeted in an old school in Birmingham, England, with cold showers and beds on the floor. They endured the same indignities as their male counterparts with a mighty dose of sexism to boot. They were curiosities, oddities to white male soldiers and officers who came to stare at them. The first time they marched through the streets of Birmingham in their crisp uniforms, cream-colored gloves, and berets they called hobby hats, they were nervous. Back home, it was only derision they had experienced, but to the English, they were VIPs. The whistles and applause brought tears to some eyes. We were treated better in Europe than in the States, recalled Gladys O. Thomas Anderson, a private first class in the 688. They thought we were beautiful. Later, Thomas and her battalion mates were barred from a local swimming pool at the request of the Americans. Their commanding officer was Lieutenant Charity Adams, the first African-American woman officer. Lieutenant Adams was the highest ranking woman of color to serve during World War II. The biggest battle she faced during the war was against the US military. After a mix-up during a troop review, a visiting general told her that he would order a white first lieutenant to show her how to run her unit. She responded, "Over my dead body, sir." She was warned she would be court-martialed if she didn't apologize. Instead, she drew up her own court-martial charges against the general for using racially charged language that the Supreme Allied Command in Europe had specifically banned. In the end, the charges against her were dropped, and later she got an apology from the general. He told her, "You outsmarted me, and I am proud that I know you." The 688s broke records for their work moving the mail, yet they were never awarded a unit citation. On the subject of decorations, of the D-Day veterans I interviewed, Bill Dabney was not the only one to receive the French Legion of Honor. Henry Parham of the 320th got one too. On the anniversary of D-Day in June 2013, the French Embassy in Washington, D.C. invited Henry Parham and his wife Ethel to a ceremony with 18 other American vets. "I am no hero," he said after receiving his medal. Henry called his service on Omaha Beach and beyond a privilege, even though he says we were treated like second-class citizens. Henry is the last of the men featured in my book who is still with us today. He is 98 years old and doing just fine with the wonderful Ethel in Pittsburgh. I'd like to close by telling you a story of hope that is perhaps instructive today. In our time, a time of great division with protests roiling cities and people of color crying out to be recognized as equal citizens with equal rights, it is interesting to note how the African Americans of World War II, marginalized and reviled in many corners of their own land, were treated abroad. After leaving Tennessee, the men of the 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion boarded train cars headed for New York, where they trudged aboard the Acatania, a luxury ocean liner converted into a troop carrier. It was one of the 3 fastest ships in the world. This is the Acatania in Lower Manhattan. Without a convoy, the ship sailed out of New York Harbor past the Statue of Liberty and headed into the hunting grounds of the North Atlantic, where German subs were gunning for ships exactly like theirs, packed with as many as 16,000 young Americans and Canadians. The sinking of any one of them would have been the greatest disaster to befall the Allies. The men arrived in Scotland in November 1943, and for the next 7 months in the villages of Oxfordshire, England, and in Wales, they would enjoy liberties that they had never thought possible. In this land, white people were happy to meet them, share their meager war rations, and forge lasting friendships. This is the only known image of the 320th in Checkenden Village Hall. In Britain, Black servicemen and women were Americans first, with funny accents and bright, white, bewildering smiles. In a nation made gray by the drudgery of war, their presence was incandescent. It was like Hollywood came to town, a man in Wales told me. He was a boy when the Black GIs arrived one day, and he has never forgotten them. The importance of these experiences abroad for hundreds of thousands of Black GIs cannot be overemphasized. It was epic. It was through their time abroad in Europe, in the Pacific, even in occupied Germany, that African Americans like Wilson Monk, Waverly Woodson, Henry Parham, and Bill Dabney learned that race hatred was not a natural state of affairs. These experiences abroad would help shape the budding American civil rights movement that would rock our country in the coming decades. Remember our man from Atlantic City? The now Sergeant Wilson Monk was billeted in the hall of a stately stone church called Trinity Methodist in the village of Abersocken in southern Wales. One day he asked the church organist if he and his friends might attend Sunday services. "Well, of course you can," said the organist, Jeffrey Pryor, who was also the village milkman. Pryor had no idea that in America, none of these men would have stepped foot in a white church. Then Jeffrey Pryor did the homesick GI who missed his sweetheart Martina one better. He introduced him to his wife, Jessie. The Pryor's 18-year-old son, Keith, was off fighting with the British forces, and Wilson Monk became their surrogate son. Like most Britons, the Pryors had never met a person of color until the Americans came. And they, in turn, were the first white people who Wilson Monk had ever called his friends. Wilson was a regular guest for Sunday lunch at their home on Old Lane, a short walk from Trinity Methodist across Glensucken Park, which during the war was dotted with Liberty Gardens. Jessie Pryor's parting gift to Wilson was a small Bible he treasured with a note written in her curling cursive bidding God to return him safely home. She signed it "Friend Forever." Jessie also began an extraordinary correspondence with Wilson Monk's mother, Rosita, back in Atlantic City. I'll close by reading a portion of my favorite of the letters. "My dear Mrs. Monk, how are you? I expect you will be very surprised receiving this letter from me. I feel I must write to you and tell you how very delighted we are meeting Wilson and having him in our home. Mrs. Monk, you have a son to treasure and feel very proud of. We love him very dearly and will do anything in the world for him. All we regret is that we cannot have him home more, but duties won't allow. He does come as often as possible. We have told him he can look upon our home as his home while he is in our country, and I will try to fill your place if only in a small way. But don't worry too much about him while he is here. We shall take every care of him. If he is ever ill or in any way wanting us, we shall be there. We look upon him now as our own. Mother to mother, very sincerely with loving thoughts, Jessie Pryor, XXXXX. Wilson Monk and his war bride Martina were married for 60 years. You can see them here in 2010. One last note about Waverly Woodson. In September of this year, a bipartisan coalition of senators and congressmen led by Senator Chris Van Hollen of Maryland introduced bills in the Senate and the House to send a request to the White House to award Waverly Woodson the Medal of Honor. If you support this action, please consider asking your representative, anyone here who isn't represented by them, to support it. Also, the homepage of my website links to a petition started by the Woodson family. You could add your name to it with a couple clicks. And for those of you who joined late, this is my book. My name is Linda Hervieux, and it has been my pleasure to talk to you. And I am very happy to take any questions that anybody might have.
Yeah, thank you so much, Linda. I did want to, I don't know if we said this at the beginning, Dwight Foreman, who's Waverly Woodson's nephew, is on the call. And I even think Joanne, Waverly's widow, is listening in. So just wanted to give a formal welcome to them and thank you for being on the call. Look, some of that stuff is extremely difficult to hear. I think, Linda, one of the things I heard in one of your interviews that you said, you were offended that you didn't know this history. And I think I felt the same way as I was reading the book. As a veteran myself, I didn't know about any of these men or women. There was an article about Dory Miller in the New York Times yesterday, I believe.
Oh, really?
And then, yeah, I'll send it to you. And then there was also over the summer in the Times, there was a whole section about Black soldiers, which is when I learned about the all-female unit that was processed the millions of letters that had not been sent to the front. And anybody that's been deployed knows how important receiving those letters are. But in hearing this history and reading this book, even though a lot of it, again, is challenging to hear, I've been filled with hope of these stories of what these men and women have done, and looking at the military today and what it is, and not that doesn't need to progress even more. But if a large organization like the military can undergo the changes that it has undergone in the 70 years since some of the things you're talking about, if that can happen, there's a lot of other progress that we can absolutely make. And so again, while some of this is challenging to hear, I take this as a message of hope as to the continued progress we can make. So with that, if anybody has any questions, just shoot me just if you want to send on the chat, I can ask the questions if you have any, and I'll give it a second.
One thing while you're looking at that, one thing that was so interesting to me was, the argument in World War II to not shake anything up and to not only abide by segregation, but to expand it. I mean, the Army was segregated. That meant if you were stationed in the North, say at Fort Devens, Massachusetts, not far from where I grew up, you were put in a segregated base. The Army not only tolerated segregation, it encouraged it. And what was interesting to me is the leaders at the time, leaders in the NAACP, also Philip Randall, who was a big union leader at the time, the Railroad Porters Union chief, their argument to the Roosevelt administration was, hey, look, you're the Army, you can. These are soldiers. You tell them what to do. You're the chiefs. And their argument was, we are not a social experiment. And what was interesting is, Eisenhower was warned in Europe that the British, among others, were not going to tolerate the kind of segregation and discrimination that was commonplace in the US. And what we saw, and I talk about this in the Britain chapter of the book, is that when left to their own devices and when told by commanders, you will not engage in any discrimination, things worked out pretty well. There was also unspeakable acts of violence in Britain perpetuated against Black soldiers by white American soldiers. We also don't hear about that. And so what was just so interesting to me was this idea that, we're at war, we're not gonna shake, you're not gonna rattle anything, we're not gonna shake the boat, we're not gonna do anything to change the state of affairs, but yet demanding loyalty from soldiers who were used to taking orders, right? So.
Yeah, Linda, we have one question come in. I wanted to ask another question. What, about the Britain chapter, and I think you referenced this a little bit. What was the difference between the people living in England and in London? And then if you look at what the Crown and imperialist Great Britain did around the world to other populations, that's, how do you reconcile that, as they were able to treat these African-American soldiers with such respect, yet around the world, I think the approach was different.
Well, of course, there's tremendous contradiction and hypocrisy, right? Isn't there? But what we saw in Britain was a welcoming of not only African-American soldiers, but colonial British soldiers who came to fight for the Crown, who came to fight for Britain, soldiers from the West Indies, soldiers from India. And Britons were warned that their colonial soldiers were full British subjects and that they should be treated with respect. The problems that the colonial soldiers encountered in Britain was from the white Americans, who had them thrown out of hotels, who had them thrown out of restaurants. What would happen later? And when I have spoken about this subject in Britain, a lot of Black Britons have said to me, we can't possibly believe that this is our positive part of our history with race, because shortly after World War II, race relations really took a dive in Britain when a lot of these colonial soldiers, their families, their compatriots tried to emigrate, tried to come to the British Isles and encountered terrible racism and discrimination.
I've got a bunch of questions coming in, so let's try to get to these. Brenda Siller has a question. She says, was there more than one barrage unit in Normandy on D-Day? My father, Floyd Siller, was a member of the 320th.
Yeah, no, that was the only barrage balloon unit on Normandy was the 320th. Yeah, they were chosen. We're not sure why. We don't know why they chose. You know, there were 30 barrage balloon battalions. We don't know why it was them, but and Brenda Seiler has done a lot to keep the memory of her dad alive.
And then got one from Gerard Harrison. Did Linda sense a regret from those she interviewed in regards to serving? What was their motivation to serve for a country that didn't treat them as well as they should have been treated?
That is a great question. No regret. Down to the last man, they said it was their duty. It's extraordinary. In the trailer of the book that I played, you can hear Henry Parham, who's still alive in Pittsburgh, 98 years old, saying, it was our duty to serve, even though we were treated as second-class citizens, down to a man. Waverly Woodson didn't wait for a draft notice. He signed up right away, dropped out of, took a leave from Lincoln University. And by the way, he was a pre-med student. He would never get his chance again to be a doctor. He would never get accepted back into medical school. Wow. So he had a career at the National Institutes of Health, but I mean, he did not become a doctor. And we have to remember that coming back from the war, it was a very different story for Black soldiers than white soldiers under the GI Bill. They were not able to get bank loans for homes. They were not able to get into colleges that had quotas. Many did, of course, many benefited, but there's many stories of discrimination following them home.
Got another question from Bryant Forrest. Bryant and I served in Korea together. So hi, Bryant. Glad you could jump on the call. His question is about, he has friends and family members that served in World War II, but none of them were willing to talk about their experiences. Just didn't want to go there. And his question is, do you have any insight with your research as to why these men are so reluctant to speak about their experiences?
Oh, well, thank you, Brian, for your service to our country. That is a great question. I think a lot of us, as a reporter, I spent a lot of years trying to interview veterans not connected to this book, just for various stories, Memorial Day, Veterans Day, other things. And I also encountered that with Vietnam vets. Right, people do not want to tell their stories. Afghanistan, my nephew was there. Very, very, very hard for some men to share their stories. Not only is it the trauma, but I think also you have an added layer for the men in this book. They did not think that they were doing anything particularly extraordinary or that anyone would want to hear about. When I got in touch with Wilson Monk, who was living in Silver Spring, he left Atlantic City after the war. I called him up, and his name is Wilson Caldwell Monk, so there's probably only one of those in the phone book, so he was one of the easier ones to find, right? And when I got him on the phone and I said, "Is this Mr. Monk from the 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion?" And there was a pause, and he said, "I've been waiting for somebody to call me for 50 years. Now, that is not entirely true. His son had asked him various questions and he did not want to talk about it. As we see, as we are all getting older, some of us get more emotional. Some of us are ready to tell our stories as we get older. And I was lucky in that a lot of these men were. Wilson Monk became something of a second father to me. And we would talk all the time on the phone. Anytime I would learn something new, I would call him to jog his memory. Also call the others as well, make a circuit from DC through Maryland out to Pittsburgh down to Roanoke. And I would share this information with them, hoping to get more stories. And the more they saw me and the more I pestered them, the more they shared. But really, it was, they talked to me because they were kind and they were polite. Yeah, I think they wanted their memories recorded, but that's a great question. Why are so many veterans reluctant to talk about this? You know, I wish
I'm glad you were persistent and they spoke to you. 2 more questions here. This kind of relates to what you were just discussing. From Jeff Jones, Linda, what was your process for selecting the stories that appear in your book? I'm sure there were many you could not capture.
Well, you know, the biggest hurdle to this book was the lack of records. If you would have told me that the whole thing would have been 5 years beginning to end, I don't know if I would have had the fortitude back in 2009 to start it. Really, like a lot of it was just, you know, feeling a sense of loyalty to these men who opened up to me and shared letters and, you know, all kinds of stories. You know, it was a wealth of stories, of images with all these men. But you have to remember one thing too, because a lot of these men were edging into their 90s. A lot of them had downsized, and so there weren't, you know, there weren't letters. I was always looking for a journal, someone who had written at the time a day-to-day account. I never got that. George Davison, who was the clerk of the unit, his son Bill shared a treasure trove of pictures with me. And he also shared a description of D-Day that his dad had written many years later. But my point in telling you this is that there actually wasn't this surfeit of stories involving the men of this unit. With a researcher, we were only able to find 12 who could give interviews. Now, this battalion initially numbered between 1,000 and 1,100 men, and the assault force on Omaha Beach was 621 with a small reserve unit back in Britain. So there were a lot of men, but those were the only ones we could find. We worked long and hard who could give interviews. I found the families of many others, but again, a lot of the families didn't know details of their father's service because they never shared the stories. And so I strung together all the stories I could. Some, you may wonder why the book isn't written like a Band of Brothers TikTok chronology throughout with this unit. And that's because, you know, you can't just go by memory. You have to also go by records to reconstruct the record, and records were just so hard to come by in this unit. So every chapter is self-contained. You can literally pick it up, read it, and not have read the previous one. So that's why, with focusing on a different subject.
Well, that looks like our last question. I want to thank you, Linda, very much for taking the time to write this book, to track down these stories. Your efforts for Waverly Woodson are no less than heroic to try to get him the recognition that he deserves. And then also compiling stories from the other branches of service. I know we've got some Navy folks on the phone, and Dory Miller, and then the women in the male corps. So thank you so much for bringing these stories to light. I want to again thank everybody that was able to join the call, and have a happy Veterans Day, everyone.
Thank you,
Thank
everyone.
you again.
Thanks, Linda. Thanks, Lou.
Thank you.
All right.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thanks, Dwight.
Yeah. Yeah, they leaving now.
Oh, it's Joanne. I hear her. Well, thanks, everyone. That was great.
Thank you, Linda. That was a terrific way to spend Veterans Day. At least starting our day here.
Oh, yeah. Well, thank you. Thanks so much. I really appreciate it. And a couple of my Baltimore friends I see tuned in as well. So that was nice.
That's terrific.
Yeah. Great. Well, if there's any follow-up at all, if anybody has any further questions, tell them, send them my way. I'm happy to answer anything. And I really appreciate it. Hopefully, if I get to Baltimore, we can all have a coffee or something.
That would be wonderful.
I would
That
love
would be
that
great.
as well. So great.
Great. Have a good day.
Thank you, Linda. Thank you,
Bye.
Nancy.
Have a good day.
Bye-bye.
All right. Bye-bye.
Hey, Lou, it's
Yeah.
Mike. Mike.
Oh, yeah, Mike, I'm sorry. I just got your note and I
Yeah.
didn't, I'll,
I just thought this would be a good time just to mention it,
yeah. We only have,
since we've got a few people still left, but
yeah, if anybody's still left on the call, we do have a Toys for Tots drive. Nancy, what day are we doing that again?
Well, we're doing it at a couple of events at the club, but I will probably put the boxes out beginning December 1st and then
Okay.
through the 13th. We'll drop
Okay.
off on the 14th. So
Great.
And then
So
we're-
December, go ahead, Mike.
no, I was just gonna say, and Nancy, we're doing the big tailgate,
Army
Navy,
tailgate. Yeah.
and you can
today.
drop the toys off at that time also when you pick up your tailgate food.
Correct.
If you've
Non-members of the club are able to do that as well. Yep.
correct.
Perfect.
Yep. I just wanted to make sure we got the word out. Thanks, guys.
Thank
Yeah, and
you.
we'll get an email post kind of call email out with all that information on it as well.
Yeah, Nancy actually created a flyer for me. I don't know if you've seen that, Lou, or not. I didn't look to see if you were on the email.
I did see it. Yes, I
Okay.
did. That'll be very helpful. We'll get that out to everybody that was on this call just so
Yeah.
we can raise awareness.
Yep, and I'm sending it to Sammy, and also I see Bill Taylor still on the phone call with us, so we'll get that out to the West Point Society of Annapolis also.
Oh, perfect. And I'll get it out to our folks here in Baltimore as well.
Great. All right, thank you. Thanks, Lou,
Thanks,
for setting this
everybody.
up. Thanks, Nancy.
Yeah,
Have
no
a good
problem.
day.
Have a good one.
Thank you all for your service. Bye.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.